terrible virus. Thank you.
Mr. Hice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Easel, could you explain in basic terms the law that addresses intellectual property that comes from federally funded research?
Yes, Congressman. It's called the Bayh-Dole Act. It was introduced on a bipartisan basis in 1980. What it does is it gives universities and public research institutions the rights to innovations that stem from federally funded research at their institutions. And
before 1980, before that law, do you have any idea how many patents the U.S. government owned?
Yes, so in 1978, the federal government had licensed less than 5% of the 30,000 patents owned at the time. There was a massive underutilization and a lack of commercialization of intellectual property and knowledge that was sitting in laboratories across the United States.
So before the law, then, there were approximately 30,000 patents that U.S. government owned, only about 5% of which, however, had commercial licensing. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right, and why is that? It's a lot of patents, a lot of potential great benefits out there, only 5% in the commercial market to go out to the public.
Well, that's right, because, well, first, government institutions and universities were not equipped or expected, or wasn't their intent to incur the risk that would be required to, take those technologies or inventions and bring them to the market as commercializable innovations.
And neither is the government.
No, exactly, neither is government. In fact, an interesting story was from the year 1968 when President Johnson asked Elmer Statz, who was then the Comptroller General of the United States, to analyze how many drugs had been developed from NIH-funded research. And Johnson was stunned when Statz's investigation came back and said that not a single drug had been developed when patents were taken from universities for commercialization by the federal government. A Statz's report from 1969 found that we found hundreds of new compounds developed at university laboratories that had not been tested and screened by the pharmaceutical industry because the manufacturers were unwilling to undertake the expense without some possibility of obtaining exclusive rights for further development. It was not until we put in place the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980 that we led to an explosive growth of innovations stemming from federally funded research.
That's my point, exactly where I want to go with this. And so you had the federal government pretty much in charge of all the patents until Bayh-Dole. Then things started changing, and actually patents were able to get into the hands of commercial licensing and thereby get to the needs of the population. Can you briefly explain what the march-in provision is in Bayh-Dole?
Yes, so the march-in provision is language that would, in very specific limited cases, give a government agency the ability to, quote, march in and compel the divulsion of the intellectual property or force additional licenses on a innovation that was result in part from some degree of federal.
And real briefly, what would be, I'm assuming that would be like an emergency.
Yes, so when the architects of the Bayh-Dole Act, Bob Dole and Birch Bayh, designed the legislation in the early 1980s, the reason they conceived of putting in the march-in rights was primarily to ensure that a licensee took the steps to commercialize.
The whole point was to get it to the public when there was a need.
That's correct.
That's correct. So has the march-in provision ever been used by the federal government?
No, it has not.
All right. So what kind of impact would using march-in impact have on research and development?
I think there is a real risk that if we ever used march-in rights, we would substantially stifle the potential of research and development. If a government ever had the capacity to march in decades later and compulsory license the IP underpinning a pharmaceutical drug on the grounds that some of it was contributed by federally funded research, and now, some number of decades later, the government declares that that price is unreasonable, that would give enterprises serious pause about investing the enormous sums required to bring innovative new drugs to the marketplace. It would stifle innovation.
So in other words, there would be a great disincentive for research and development in various companies if they spent the billions of dollars, if they assumed the risk to develop drugs, and then all the while knowing that the federal government could march in and take that patent away from them, you're saying that would massively disincentivize R&D.
That's correct, Congressman. There was a great case from 1995. something called CRADAs, Cooperative Research and Development Agreements. In 1989, NIH inserted a reasonable pricing clause into those CRADAs. The amount of collaboration between industry and government subsequently cratered, and when that requirement for reasonable pricing of a subsequent innovation was repealed, the number of CRADAs instantaneously rebounded in 1995, and we again stimulated effective public-private partnership towards developing new drugs.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.